right, here we go. Hi, I'm in a different space here today. We're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance, but Dave Hogue, who's our usual chair, is out sick today, so you guys give me vice chair, Houston Olam, as running the meeting. So let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, I'd like to welcome everybody here today. Thanks for joining us. Good to see our familiar faces out here. So today we have a few different things going on, and if you were at our last meeting, you'll know that we talked about going through the land use and transportation plan by section as these meetings go on, and so we're going to be working through basically section 2 and 3 today. But before we do that, we're going to go through our previous meetings minutes, make sure those look good. That will lay out what we're doing today as well, and then we'll get into the presentation from Ida and Kim. So, members, if you guys will please review the minutes, and then when we're ready, get a motion to agree to the minutes.
I'll make the motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Thank you. Anybody have any discussion on these minutes? Now let's take a vote. If you approve the minutes, say aye. Aye. Anybody nay? Great, minutes are approved. Thank you. All right, so per usual, we're going to roll straight into a presentation from Ida and Kim. What's interesting about this week is that we have both Kim and Ida presenting from their digital spaces. So we are going to look at what corresponds to sections 2 and sections 3 in the land use and transportation plan. So committee members, as we prepared for this meeting, we were all asked to review section 2 and section 3. As we go through the slides, please feel free to let Ida finish a topic and then jump in with any questions or comments about what it is or what you may have to think about it. Ida, if you could also kind of tee us up, cue us up for discussion points and whatever, then that'd be appreciated as we move forward. So over to you.
Excellent, thanks so much. And as a happy surprise, that Kim should be rolling into the building momentarily, so he will be able to join you in person. But I think that what I have planned for us as a review of chapter 2 will allow Kim to listen in, and then as he arrives, I will support him in walking through some data and information in addition to some of the chapter 3 conversations. So we have a little bit of an interactive meeting planned for you all today. So as Houston kindly introduced, please feel free to CPAC Committee jump in with questions, and then as those assembled for the meeting have additional questions or follow-up, we'll organize that with some time structure just to make sure that we are respectful of each other's time. So as we roll through phase 3, we have been deep into the research and beginning some of the alignment of the data and information that we have gained from the work thus far and the community engagement in a way that we want to bring you all a keen understanding of what the existing plan holds and walk with you chapter by chapter through that existing plan and having that conversation around really asking the question, what elements are aligned, what elements are missing, and how can we make sure that we, your consultant team, conduct our research and frame key questions to help move the conversations forward and give you all the best tools that we can to help you face your current and future challenges in this planning space. So what I'm taking the liberty of doing is condensing each chapter or each element of the chapter 2 natural features section into some very key elements to help us walk through. And then following each discussion, I will kind of open the floor for conversation or discussion around how these elements are showing up in your daily life as residents of Townsend today. So the purpose of this chapter is to examine how natural features influence development and how land use decisions are made in Townsend. And the key topics that will be covered during this section are climate, air quality, topography, drainage patterns and flooding, water quality, and soils. And just a reminder that these are what is existing in your current approved document at this stage, but we will be bringing these up to date, aligning them with current understandings, and where necessary, adding to them to ensure that you all are well positioned to moving forward in this space. So we'll start our first section here around air quality and highlight that this specific section goes into detail on the non-attainment status, which you all are in as it results to the Knoxville metropolitan area, and details on how that work is mitigated as it relates to primarily air pollution caused by a variety of factors within that metropolitan area. It also discusses the impact of health and health on the economy and health on people. Factors that contribute to the non-attainment status as illustrated by the Knoxville area, and then understanding the role of transportation and cars in preserving or mitigating the air quality in the region. So I'm going to pause here and first ask the CPAC committee first if there's elements of this that you wish the document spoke to in more detail, or that you would like us, the consultant team, to ensure that we address, update, or add research to this narrative.
Does anybody have any thoughts on air quality? Mayor, can I call on you?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ida, and I'll share with you some comments on air quality, but let me just go back to the paragraph before that on climate. So it talks about greatest known flood to have occurred February 1875, but I think we've had some pretty significant floods here in Townsend. 93, big flood there, and so we need to make sure that all the flooding information is a little bit more current. I don't know what they would what threshold they're using. They do say other significant flood events, but flooding is something I think that really is important to us. And I know we're going to talk about drainage patterns coming up in this chapter, but flooding and putting that as something right up front is I think really important for our city. In terms of air quality, I've read this section, and I think a lot of it has to do with particulate matter relative to automobiles. I think that's still quite relevant as we get more folks that are visiting Townsville, of course, have more automobiles. But the other source of potential, albeit more episodic, is from wildfires. And so if there is something that we need to consider with respect to wildfire, so when a wildfire comes and the wind is in a certain way, it can actually come and settle here in Townsend, as we are a little bit of a cove. And so if there's something here in natural features, I don't see anything about wildfires and natural features at all in this chapter. And so I think there's input on air quality, and of course we'll, I think, pick up wildfire impacts in some of the other sections, but I think there is something relevant there as well.
On that topic, can you advise us on whether or not wildfires and flooding fall into singular categories themselves, or whether or not they are natural disasters, and kind of what the best practices are for determining, how do you classify those items?
Great question, Lisa. Thank you, and thank you, Mayor, for that thought. Completely. So what we're seeing right now in kind of the trends on a national level as they pertain to this is really a case-by-case basis. With current leadership, there's been a trend to break them apart into flooding, air quality, fires, even things like landslides, and even building in communication logic or communication guidelines in terms of what the city's responsibilities are in communicating with and to citizens in the case of an emergency. So not just understanding what this looks like, but almost thinking ahead to what a disaster plan would look like, and how the planning documentation can not go into the full process and procedures, but basically outline the commitment of the city in how they intend to communicate in the case of emergency.
Thanks, Ida. So I feel like as we look through these sections, what you introduced there was like the planning side of it, kind of the idea of how this data supports what we should do. And that's kind of, we'll get to the conclusion of the section as we get there, but there are a few shoulds in our conclusions that I thought was interesting and noteworthy. But what you just laid up there was that one of the core things that this sets up is our planning, right? We know this, this informs how we plan. Second, it informs how we deter certain things, right? Whether or not we build roads or whatever, and other ways to mitigate that as well. Are there any other major actions that this data sets up for us beyond planning and deterrent?
Yeah, I think the deterrent really covers the other element there, which is risk management and understanding how development decisions either do or do not mitigate potential risk to the citizens of Townsend.
Great. Committee members, any questions or any comments on this first section particularly?
It's probably definitely not my strong suit, but I just want to make sure that we're addressing anything going into the river. And I don't know if that would come into that section or not.
I think we're going to cover that up here in soils.
Yeah, I see that too, but I just want to make sure.
So Ida, you want to keep going on and we can address that as we go?
I was just going to ask.
Of course, and I'll also just flag that at the end of this run-through, I have a full slide dedicated to what's missing and what needs to be added. So as there are specific sections or additions needed, we'll capture that in our notes as well.
Okay, so
the next,
do you all want to just wait until the end of her section 2 and we'll go from there? That good for you? Okay, thanks, Adam.
you're welcome. So next we'll think about topography, and as you know from living there primarily, Townsend is located in a beautiful valley that has slopes of around 7% at max. It's really important to consider topography in the development to avoid negative impacts. And one of the elements here that is highlighted that I think is aligned and hasn't changed much is a guideline on development for slopes. So understanding the slope percentage in this table is from 0% slope all the way up to a 24% slope, and understanding how appropriate uses and street standards change based on the topography in the area in order to protect the citizens who live there. And then I'll open it up for questions or comment based on topography.
All right, let's go on through all of these, and then we can kind of come back around once we're done.
Sure thing.
Ida,
Yes.
Ida, when you come around to the discussion, I have a comment to make, okay?
So next we'll discuss drainage and flooding. So the few paragraphs here really condensed highlight the concern around increased risk of flooding due to topography and climate, the impacts of runoff on water quality, and the hazardous flooding that can occur based on the current development regulations. I will highlight that since this, we also have in paragraph 2 here, some conversations regarding tourism businesses highlighted here that we can circle back around on as well. From here, without question, we can move forward onto water quality. Thinking about the Little River as a primary source of drinking water for Blount County, and the importance of protecting the water quality in the Little River as it flows through Townsend, as well as considering mitigating potential negative impacts of downstream water quality. And the roles of stormwater runoff and the regulations that the City of Townsend can enforce around stormwater runoff. Next, there's a great soils map that is in the plan that I'm sure you'll have seen that highlights 24 different soil types that have been identified in and around Townsend that are important as they indicate the type of development that can occur based on the permeability of those soils. So it's important to again highlight the importance of functioning and permeable soil that can allow for development given the infrastructure that is available in Townsend, whether that be for residential or commercial. It also discusses in detail the limitations that might be important to understand in more detail based on the soil types that you will have. So from here, we'll open it up to more discussions. Mayor Prater also mentioned the conclusions chapter, which I'm happy to kind of review in more detail. But I think one of the key pieces here is really taking some of the key elements that I highlighted just now in sake of time and making sure that we are understanding the balance of commercial and residential and the balance of how clearly can it impact the future of the community and how we take natural factors into consideration as to how they inform development as we move forward. So the key questions I just wanted to highlight here, we can walk through them individually or as a group based on what you're hearing and experiencing, is are there any additional natural features that should be considered in the updated plan? How can a plan better address the impacts of specifically flooding and fire on natural resources? What strategies can be implemented to improve air quality and reduce pollution? And what are the measures that can mitigate flood risk and protect water quality? And so these are just 4 questions that have come up already in community engagement or from our conversations that I wanted to just highlight and build upon as needed.
Thanks, Ida. So, you were going to say something a few minutes ago. Is what you were going to say still relevant?
It was about the air quality, and just knowing, or asking the question if those numbers were still correct, or if they've changed, improved, or gotten worse.
With air quality?
Yes, ma'am.
That's a very good question. We have data in the form of aerosol optical thickness models that we can generate to understand that on an annual basis or a case-by-case basis. As I'm sure those of you with allergies or with sensitive systems have experienced, those factors change on a case-by-case basis. But because of the nature of the valley, there's risk of pollutants that are generated from traffic in and around Townsend to get caught there based on weather patterns that emerge. So that was the we're looking into.
Logan, you bring up a good question about when our data is going to be updated. And Ida, can you give us an idea of how you and ETDD are going about updating this data and when we can expect said updated data?
Yes, so per our scope of work, and this is an interesting partnership that we are actively navigating, is per our work scope, Kim and his team at ETDD are really supporting this data research section. My team at SC Group have reviewed this document and our existing methodology and feedback from the community and have developed a series of follow-up questions, recommendations, and support really for Kim and his team as research continues. So that is all underway, and I've also budgeted time to support Kim in making sure that we're pulling not just from the work that he's doing with University of Tennessee, but also from some of the resources that we use for this work when we're working with other communities nationwide.
Okay, thank you. Mayor, I'm going to ask you a question. It's from the conclusion of section 1, and it says that development within within the city should first consider the site restrictions from natural factors during the planning phases. I found this sentence interesting because it uses the word should. That's clear guidance from people that made this, is that these things should be considered for specific development. I'm curious whether or not this group needs to be interpreting data that Ida and Akim bring to us, from their experiences and all, and helping to craft different sentences in these conclusions that use the word should.
Well, my understanding is that the purpose of the Land Use and Transportation Plan is to serve as a reference for the Planning Commission. So Planning Commission needs to be able to have data and information to be able to take into account for when we develop new ordinances or modify existing ordinances. So that's the value of this. The words like should, I think are probably okay, because there's a whole variety of factors here, and this is, the Land Use and Transportation Plan is intended to inform, not to necessarily be, as prescriptive. There is a section in here, probably the most directive part of this is the implementation plan for the land use policy. So I keep talking about chapter 5 and 6, so those are important. I think that's where it becomes a little more directive. And so in these sections here that provide that basic information, I think it's informational for the Planning Commission, would be my interpretation.
Yeah, I think about the conversations we've had over light pollution and dark skies and that kind of stuff, and how the natural habitat, the natural world around us has been at the center of this conversation. And so I find it interesting that this plan says the word should first. And it's it's similar to a sentence a little lower that says the city of Townsend may use the subdivision and zoning regulations as tools. It's almost, I guess what I'm asking is, these seem to be very they're very legal terms in terms of when deployed a certain way, they can be restrictive or prescriptive. And so I view our job not to use words like that. I view our job to help get all the data together from our consultant groups, to put it all in the right place, and then use and then inform the folks from the Planning Commission, and then, for the City Commission to make the decisions and to actually interpret them that way. I just find this to be very interpretive, and I'm wondering if we need to be interpretive through the process.
Okay. I'm not, like I said, I'm not concerned that it's overly restrictive in this section. It's just things that need to be taken into consideration. So if there are other words taken into consideration, might be another word, that way to phrase it. So, but again, these are all things that should help inform the development of those things that are more specific, like the zoning ordinances, subdivision regulations, that type of thing.
So
If I could, Mr. Chairman, I would like to feedback on the first question here. One of the things that we found in our surveys, and we've had a lot of discussion, including in our recent workshop, does have to do with light pollution and dark skies. And so some communities, I'm aware, consider that as a natural feature of their community. So I can remember when I was growing up, I used to go out and look out at the kitchen window, and I couldn't see nothing but dark. And it's not that way anymore. If you look, all around, you've got different things. But I think still, at this point, we still have a relatively, dark sky here in Townsend. And that is a natural feature. So if there was something missing here, would be maybe some discussion about, is there a way to compare that relatively across communities? So if the community wanted to take that into consideration as a natural feature, something we always have. As you look over toward the park, that's always going to be dark. So that's a good thing. But it is something that stood out to me as captured in our survey from our visitors and from our residents. And so it might be missing here as a natural feature.
I've got a question for Ida. The first phrases that she said that they were using Knoxville-based material because that's the only large city. Well, in reality, we have a whole different climate than Knoxville does. For instance, to give you an idea, we don't have flood control here, and Knoxville does. It has 3 major dams, TVA dams, that are regulating the amount of flow that comes down. Here, we don't have anything. So anything that rains up there is going to be down here. So our flood control is much different than the Knoxville, the approach to flood control. Same thing with air quality. Your prevailing winds come from the west here, and we had 60, 70 mile an hour winds down this valley the other day, and Knoxville didn't have hardly any. If they did, it may be 30 miles, but it was changing. So using some of that data as the very basis to work from, you're already starting with something that's uniquely different.
I think we need to be conscious of that, so council is not.
And
Thank you, just the opportunity to clarify that. So in the air quality section, the reason I made mention to that is not because we're using Knoxville as a baseline or example by any means. It's a major air quality impact zone for the city of Townsend comes from Knoxville. There's regulations that were discussed in the initial formation of this plan that resulted because of the December 2004 non-attainment designation area that helps to monitor any community that's within that footprint designated by that 2004 plan. So you're completely right, sir. We are focusing all of our efforts on the city of Townsend, but you are impacted by air quality from outlying metropolitan areas. And the Knoxville work that has been done for the 2004 attainment area falls underneath that regulation as well. So that's a great baseline to make sure that we're advocating for you to have good quality air.
Richard, is that good for you? Okay. Your question there is towards the end about measures that can be taken to mitigate flood risk or water quality. I'm curious if you've worked in other towns that have a border on one side of the river and not have both sides of the river under jurisdiction. I know we're talking about the larger cove here, but just curious, what the differences are, like natural versus man-made mitigation factors or water protection that can be administered or obtained when you only control one side.
That's a great question. It's actually very common. There's many communities whose borders were established by natural waterways, and it's actually even very common. I can think of a number of examples of city-county lines or even county-county lines on either side of the river designation. What I've seen most effective is opportunities to work with your soil and water conservation districts, which really do a great job of thinking outside the box and bringing in grant funds to support mitigation efforts at large. So this is an opportunity for the city of Townsend to share their values around water quality and then partner with agencies that work better across county, city lines in order to affect change or introduce mitigation strategies upriver and downriver.
Great, thank you. Mayor Don.
Just a couple of other points. That raises another good one. The bulk of our urban growth boundary is on the other side of the river. So I think as we're considering, looking at our community and developing this plan, if you look in this section, there's a map here that has the urban growth boundary, and the bulk of it is on the other side of the river. So we have from time to time been petitioned by neighborhoods to join the city from the other side of the river, and it is within our urban growth boundary. So we probably need to be thinking in terms that there could be a time in the future that the city limits would go on the other side of the river. I just want to come back also on the second bullet, and I don't want to belabor the point on, I know we've got a lot more to go through. I don't want to belabor the point on wildfires, but there might be some information from Gatlinburg that came as a result of their experience in terms of what they learned from that, and being in close proximity to the national park, thinking about the rate of clearing of brush, how dry is brush. When it comes to flooding, I think this section would also benefit from some flood maps. And I think the flood maps should be current, so current, in fact, as they ought to include as sort of an upper bound the amount of rainfall that fell on the other side of the mountain during the recent flooding over there. So that's not unrealistic at this point. At a certain point in time, it might have been unrealistic to have that amount of rainfall, but we've seen it happen. And so having some additional flood maps that might, help us to understand, what our city would look like if you got a 100-year flood, a 150-year flood, or some sort of flooding based on a certain amount of rainfall. What are some of those things that we might need to consider?
And Don, do we need to include other bodies of water too, or is that already included in that? Maybe just without seeing it? Is there other ponds and things like that?
Think about ponds in there. We've got a pond at the city park.
I just kind of ran it through the AI, and I'll tell you, that's one of the things that I brought up. Inclusion of water, one of the things that it sees lacking, inclusion of water bodies. And then updated information, like you said, in a bunch of different areas.
I think that you'd find when they engineered the road down here, they took into consideration various points that y'all talked about, because that's where they put the drainage across the road to catch the largest amount of water from the longest distance. And there's those tunnels, walk tunnels, they're emergency pipe closed. But they got all the drainage around drainage tanks or pipes.
I think that one more thing that I think would be beneficial to expand in this section is when thinking about soil types, to also be looking at new technology in septic systems. And so one of the things that, if we become faced with the decision about public sanitary sewer, would be what's the ability of the city to continue to maintain septic systems. And part of that has to do with the soil. Part of it also has to do with new technologies in septic systems, which might allow us to, preserve that capability a little longer.
So I believe one of the problems with septic that we run into in the past is that, inadequately draining into the river inadvertently, right? And having that affect the water quality throughout the river. I mean, I know I'm against the water quality myself, but I totally agree that the understanding of modern septic systems is missing in this section.
Okay, I'm done.
Let's move on. All right, Ida, Kim, can you guys please begin the, call it chapter 3, next section, please?
Of course. Is it in person yet or no?
I do not see him, but he is.
I'll be there in about 2 minutes.
All right, so we're gonna keep vamping up here then.
Yes, we're gonna be there.
Megan, you don't have anything else?
Well, if you give me some time.
Here's something, I'll just say a list over here. Public utility infrastructure. Is that something that's necessary? Is that something we don't have? Public utility infrastructure.
Public utility infrastructure. We're coming up to that, aren't we?
I think so.
Yeah.
We'll talk about, the needs section.
We're going to
Okay,
get that
so it's saying- okay.
in the next section.
I'm sorry, it's saying something about maps.
I cut you off, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Thanks, Christina. That sounds good. What I'll just share is, I wanted to, with the 2 minutes that we have, if it's okay, just opening up to the room, if there is just in 2 or 3 words, specific natural features that you have concerns about as citizens that you would like to see added that we haven't yet discussed.
So if you couldn't hear her specifically, I was just wondering if anybody in the crowd has any specific natural features that you may have concerns about here in town, whether you want to elaborate on them or not, or just kind of talk about what they may be. I mean, how about I'll put into public the dams that we have throughout the river. Whether or not that's under our jurisdiction, it's not. But are those the concerns about holding water back, knocking them down, whatever there's been conversation on. So that's the only feature that I can really think of, that's natural per se, other than like the road boundaries and such. From the lack of movement in the room, I say there's nothing else.
Okay, sounds good. I kind of thought there are a few opportunities or things that I see in other planning initiatives underneath this chapter. One is wildfire mitigation, landslide hazards, invasive species management, stormwater management, groundwater protection, climate adaptation strategies, green infrastructure, alternative transportation options. I think would fall into a different category for the way yours plan is structured, but it's important to kind of think about the opportunities for improved bike and ped connectivity to have a positive impact on air quality, and then also the role of public education or outreach as it pertains to the natural features that you find important.
Where does the role of like a view come into town? You know, so we're surrounded by mountains, and I think one of the things that I love, and I think a lot of the folks here love, is just the views that we have. And I've always said that coming out of off 321 from Arrow, a lot of the curves, you almost like have a headspace opens up, you're constricted, and all of a sudden you're wide open. I'm curious if that sort of almost like lack of natural feature in our immediate way gives us the views, gives us views to the mountains. So I'm just curious if that's a development question or if that's a natural feature question.
So that is such a timely question. Literally at like 2 o'clock today, I had a meeting with Lynn Crump, who is the Viewshed project manager for Scenic Virginia. So had a great conversation with her. She's doing a lot of work. And the way I'll most simply explain it, and then we'll go into Kim's section here, is it is not by any means a way of establishing criteria or restriction on development, but it is a way of gathering public opinion in alignment with which views are most important to a community. So if there was a situation in which that view was threatened, there's a aligned community voice that has a designation behind it. For example, a designated viewshed or a designated scenic view. Maybe a good example for Tennessee would be there's scenic drives that are established throughout Tennessee that are known to be a certain type of recreation. And so I'd be happy, if you're interested in thinking more, I'd be happy to kind of summarize that conversation I had with Lynn for a different project and maybe do some research and see what exists in Tennessee that might be appropriate to kind of capture that perspective.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think the mayor has a few comments to say.
Yeah, I'm just going to tag on to that, Houston. I think that the viewshed, that's the term that I hear used. What's the viewshed? And what that really means to people is I can drive up and down the road and I can still see the mountains. So viewshed is something that people value in Townsend. We've got it. And how it impacts our policies, could be building height. And so I think it's a good point to bring up. It is a natural feature.
I think that's already in our requirements.
I believe it's on 321, right? So it's
the Heritage Center had to lower the building because of the double height and the high roof.
Yeah.
That's why they dug it in.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a height restriction.
I think the difference we're talking here is on building codes have a certain height requirement, but this would be almost like a group, or what Ida is mentioning is almost like a group that has an aligned perspective on what height does to block view. But yes, same can be said for power lines, same can be said for vessel.
It's a natural feature.
What I'm seeing right now is Scenic America, which is the national designation, does have Tennessee Scenic Byways listed, but I'm not seeing individual programming like Scenic Virginia has. But this is something that I'd be happy to kind of just chase this thread and see what I find.
Thanks, Ida. I'm looking at the clock now. I'm going to go ahead and move on to Kim, who just walked in a few minutes ago. Kim,
Great, welcome to it.
Thank you.
All right, Kim, I think Ida has some slides for you here. Will you find your way to a microphone in one way or another? And Ida, if y'all can tag team this and see where we go.
Excellent.
Good evening. have some baseline information and data that we've been working on. It's been a bit tricky because we want to make sure that it reflects as close as possible to what Townsend's area is, rather than to the larger cove or even beyond that into the county. So we have some slides that have been developed. They are part of what is on your slide presentation, and we have been working with the UT Data Center to compile them. And those challenges that we had to make sure that they are best reflective of Townsend is what we've been working on with the UT Data Center. So the first round of that information was sent to UT. We had a discussion that made us go back and relook at that data, and the second round to that conversation with UT is going to happen soon enough. What we've done after refining the data, and these are just the sketches of that data in terms of public presentation for digestion at a workshop that is yet to be completed. But some of the things that we have been talking about, for example, with the pyramid, with the population pyramid, are some rather routine observations, one of which is that there has been some discussion around tourism workforce recruitment. And we wondered if that might change at some point and how that will impact things dealing with schools and or housing or whatever else, especially with the workforce that is needed for the tourism sector. So that's one thing that we want to further hone in and also to confirm with UT Data Center. With the child pyramid slide, we want to know what enrollment numbers that might imply or portend for facilities planning and management. So if there's anything that needs to happen to the schools or any parks and recreation, those are some of the things that we have to want to consider when it comes to planning for that child pyramid that we have over there. If you've noticed that there are two bigger columns, one of which is going to graduate to the next column, as the other one at the far end is going to graduate out in terms of children that are no longer of a supervisory age. So the question is, when those kids go out and their parents are still around, are those parents going to stay or are they going to move on? And if they move on, what might that portend for housing stock availability? Are those houses going to go on the market? And at what price index will it go on the market in terms of different income cohorts, especially for people who want to continue to live and or to work in Townsend. And with the geographic mobility, we basically also are mentioning, similar to that slide, what will this hold for household composition stability, especially for the 0 to 17-year-olds who will be moving on in some form or fashion, either to college or looking for a job or moving out and elsewhere. With the racial demographics, I don't think there's much comments to make about that. It's a pretty homogeneous community. It might change, especially if you start recruiting workforce like Gatlinburg. You might need to start recruiting in interns from across the world to come and staff some of your facilities, and that might change it. But I don't think it will change it in any way appreciably. With educational attainment, we are wondering what are the job opportunities or recruitment efforts that should be targeted at, let's say, for example, the non-graduates and also those with associate degree holders for the tourism sectors especially, because I think we can all agree that tourism is the main income earner or the main industry for Townsend. So the question is, how do we recruit those people, if indeed we need to recruit them for workforce development for the community and even for any other sort of subsidiary economic activity that might happen in Townsend as tourism we expect might grow to some point. With distance traveled, we have things, which slide on the jobs by industry? Okay, let's do jobs by industry, sorry. There again, the growth in the tourism sector is to be expected, and under what legitimate controls may that be best managed? There again, what could these trends tell us about housing stock scarcity, housing affordability for workforce, and among other things. So if it's growing, how are we preparing ourselves for the jobs in terms of recruitment, housing, services needed to supply the tourists and the workforce and the residents of the community? So that's another thing that we're going to be sifting through further with UT Data Center, such that we can hold a workshop on that end. And then with income, as you can see, Townsend is a very rich community, and you have a lot of people who have a very high level of income. The vast majority who earn over 75,000. What does that say for the affordability of the other income levels that live in the city? And then also with what potential housing stock availability and at what price levels and per what sort of market. In that sense, then, is these houses that these people are buying, who is it affordable for? And what sort of housing stock might you want to consider for those at the middle, low income levels? And will that mean that you would want to encourage some other forms of housing, be it cottage courts, allowing for some building code revisions, whereby you might want to allow accessory dwelling units either detached or as part of the housing stock that can be retrofitted for some sort of rental space or lower income, medium income level of resident. And then with the housing listings, we have also consulted with East Tennessee Realtors, and those 2 slides have been sent off to them this morning for them to give us some finality on what that scripting should be for presentation at a workshop. So, and then also, again, something dealing with housing prices, this upper 6 figures, and it's climbing. The housing now is approaching well over 700,000 and approaching 800,000 for the average home. Might it cross over to the $1 million mark? And what does that mean? Yeah, 700,000 is there. And so if it comes to workforce retention, housing affordability, might that raise a concern? And what should be the policy for, once again, for alternative housing options? So those are some of the things that we are working with. These are things that are my impressions that I want to get vetted by the people who are experts in the field of data and or housing.
Kim, can we stop you just for a second?
Sure.
Or is that okay? So as we listen to this, and it's almost easy in some ways to imagine natural features. These are things that we see every day as we interact with. But when it comes to these socioeconomic trends, I'm not trained in this. I don't know if any of us are really trained in gathering this sort of data. So I'm curious what use we are to you in this. And I ask that in the sense of are you looking for what other data would be useful here and us to give you those ideas, or are we kind of along for the ride as you update this data and work through it?
Well, on one level, you are in for the ride because you're going to get all this information, and the question is, how does this translate to ways in which you can do some control, some management in terms of your economic, development? I would say that some of the things that you should consider, given the sort of data and the conversation that preceded this, is, for example, you mentioned the Little River. So on the Little River end of town, might you want to consider stricter building development codes, whereby all those homes have to be elevated to make sure that they can withstand any floods or of any sort. Might you want to have stricter sewer regulations over there? As Ida said, to think out of the box, might you want to just allow sewage on that end, piped sewage on that end of Townsend, and maybe figure out ways that it shouldn't happen on the other end of Townsend, given that you're worried about water quality on that end of Townsend. So those are sort of some of the things that this might translate to in terms of building codes, for example, and also in terms of intensity of development. So you might have higher density standards for the banks of the river. You might allow for higher housing densities on the other side of 321, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing that. I wonder if we can ask you a question about data, or if I can ask you a question about data. One of the things that, as I read through this, that didn't really jive with me was that, this talks about how a lot of people who live here are employed in hospitality or in retail in one way or another, and yet it also states that we have an extremely high level of wealth in this town. And I'm curious, where we're pulling that data from. Is it actually city residents we're working with? And I ask
Yes.
and I wonder if we can, as we go through this, pull outliers out of our data set that may be skewing things one way or another. Is that a methodology that works? And I ask because, in retail and hospitality, you're not in this income bracket that we're talking about. And so if we're saying that the majority of citizens are working in retail and hospitality, and then we're saying that the average income is, hundreds of percent higher than what they can obtain, I think that's a juxtaposition that's difficult to plan with.
Well, yes, so a couple of things. One is, it implies that there are people moving in here, residing here, who are very wealthy. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those people who are living here under those income brackets are working in the tourism sector. It also implies that people are coming out of the city to come and work here. As we had found out at the business focus group, that was one of the challenges, to keep those sort of that income level staying here, so you don't have too many people commuting here with some discomfort, if you know what I mean. At the same time, it also means that the city should also think of ways to have a community that has a broad base of income levels, because if it's on only one level, then you have a housing stock that is maybe, I would suggest to some extent, a lot of retirees with retiring income who have come here to live. The question then is, when those people pass on, the housing stock will come up onto the market. The question, will it go higher towards $1 million mark? Because now the housing will now become on the market, the Wall Street market, where there will be investors speculating about the housing stock, for example. So that's another thing that you have to think about. Now, in terms of comparison, we are also looking at Rising City and another city, which skips my mind, that they're both on the other end of the forest in North Carolina.
And Maggie Valley, is it?
Say it again? Yeah, Maggie Valley and Rising City. So we're going to get some comparisons in that regard for something about how they are tackling it. We also, at some point, think of a comparison. I would suggest, as I've mentioned before, that when it comes to the dark skies, you should look at what Alcoa has achieved in the newly forming downtown area adjacent to the airport, where they've achieved this dark skies mitigation goal.
Houston, I'll just jump in on one quick note here as kind of an example. So one of the ways that Group is supporting Kim and ATDAP in the research is Kim and I chatted last week just about some of this data, and one of those key questions that we wanted to better understand is this community dynamics framework. And so I worked with my team to pull the data that is reflected here on the screen to try and get a better understanding of what that inflow-outflow of the workforce looks like and how that impacts what it means to live, work, and play in Townsend. And from what U.S. Census data is indicating, there's around almost 500 people who are traveling into Townsend to work. Obviously some of that is seasonal, but that's a good baseline. There's 207 people who are reportedly traveling out of Townsend to work, and there are just 13 people who are both working and living in the city of Townsend.
That's interesting. Cool. Thanks,
So I
Matt.
think that's an example of kind of how we as a group want to support Kim and his team is as these big questions of like, that's a really interesting number, that doesn't make sense. We can kind of align time strategically in ways that we can kind of help zoom in or flesh out or try and ask those big why questions for some elements.
Yeah, thanks, Ida. I would also just request from you and Kim or y'all's groups that, when we go to talk about people that live and work here, or people that come in out of town, that we are documenting like people that live here and do not work at the same, you make sure we're kind of using that the same voice, because I think that's potentially a large population that we have here, and anyway, it doesn't seem to be captured when you talk about workforce. You know, it's retiring.
And we can pull that data from census information as well. That's a mapping opportunity.
All right, Mayor and Colin, if you want to add anything, or do you want Ida to keep moving?
Just wanted to make one comment. Now you gave me a second one to make. So I like this, capturing this idea of people that are living and working in Townsend. I think that's, that could be really important if you wanted to, people don't like to have to commute. And so that's an important thing to consider. The other thing is looking at trends over time. So where are we going? Do we have some projections in the current land use and transportation plan? They look back and use year 2000 as the benchmark. So ultimately, some of these data I think would be useful to look at trends, and if there's a possibility to make any projections, based on something solid, a good algorithm or something, that could be useful.
And I wanted to make one more comment that I was tempted to make whilst I was driving. The idea is that another thing is that you have height limitations over here, and the mention was made about the topography. So for example, one of the things that you might want to look into is how much you would allow for subterranean stories, floors, as opposed to it going up to go down. And then to make sure that given the slope of the terrain that you allow for that, if possible. And if you allow for that, what regulations would you put in place? As you would want to do something with an engineer's report, you might want to also require an architect's report as well as an engineer's report, and then also a surveyor's report to make sure that there are no sinkholes and all that. So those are things that you could also look into in terms of building codes for.
Yeah, that's a good. I've seen maps with karst features like sinkholes and other things that can inform. And I know we've got some sinkholes around here, so I don't know if that would be a useful thing to have in our documentation as well. Okay.
Is there anything distinguishing the height of a building, say, at the river level versus on the side of a mountain? I mean, is that something that's taken into consideration whatsoever?
Well, I think it should be. And that's what I'm trying to imply here, that for the riverside, I think we should we should think about stricter, elevated structures. And then for the other side of the mountain, we should also consider ways in which, if you want to keep the height level, to keep the view shed, but you also want to allow for some more development, then you can like sort for subterranean, but you have to make sure you have the right regulations in place to address that.
One of the hard parts of this for us as we work through this process and for the town in the long run is that it's just not a very wide town. You can have 10 parcel zone Riverside or something, and then 10 parcel zone, for Mountainside or whatever, and we don't get up into Dry Valley or don't go across the river yet, and so we've got this almost like strange little thing where we're talking about such a minute area here that we have to be very specific into what we're saying, because it is quite a small area.
I think that's a good point, but that's why I did bring up, Mr. Vice Chair, our urban growth boundary. So we should be, looking at this within the context of our urban growth boundary.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we're being cognizant of time here. Yeah, well, Ida, you want to wrap up what you have here, and then we have a good of the community to finish us out on here.
Yep, of course. Thank you so much for sharing your valuable time with us this evening. Really appreciate it. We're here in February. We are continuing to work through ground truthing and aligning data. Kim and his team is. Kim, I know you also wanted to briefly mention a question about that historical data piece. So what I chatted with Kim about, because I know that he's been chatting to Phil about the historical data piece for a while, is I'm going to ask my team in probably early next week, just with how the week is shaping up right now, to put together a list of the existing historical elements that are captured in Townsend as they can find. We'll then get that list out to CPAC for review and ask you all to either add or subtract to that list as necessary to help inform Kim further on his research.
Yes, and to that, if I may add that we don't have the bandwidth to do that legwork for you. But we also want to encourage you that you have spoken about meeting up with the owner of the theater. You are a very rich resource for the community. So I would encourage you all to sit down, think through what that stuff is with the aid of SC Group, given the list they'll give you, and say which of these things are of interest to you, including archaeological stuff, so that we can then task our historic preservation planner to say what is possible, what is the strategy, what is the development, what's the funding avenues that you can pursue for preserving these things to be part of the personality and the development of towns.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you guys bringing that list kind of to us to start. It's a much more approachable topic when we can have that list, in front of us. Thank you.
Sure.
Meeting, does that have to be a public meeting to talk about the historical places?
If we're gonna have a workshop, I think we'd wanna,
It should be a workshop.
I think we'd wanna open it up.
I'm not sure that I have the capacity for a workshop. What I'm offering to assist with is that I'm going to assign Noelle from my team to basically research all the historical data that she can find on properties in Townsend that might be important for either archaeological or historical reasons, and make sure that those are encapsulated on a map. And I'm going to give that to the CPAC committee and ask you all to kind of validate and verify what our research is showing. And then bring that back to CPAC to have a community comment.
So Christine, I think in an ideal world, we would receive a list and be able to do our homework on it, think about it, and then discuss it at the next meeting, so we're not having to do a secondary discussion on it.
The question I have is I had mentioned to you before, I had a Facebook post, and there's a lot of information on there that needs to be pulled out. So,
Yeah, I feel like that's a good bring come to this meeting and we discuss it.
but someone's gonna go in there and pull it. Or was there?
One of us, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, not me.
Fair enough. So maybe we get the deadline that if by Monday of next week, if y'all could share with me what you have existing, I'll then take that and run with it.
Okay, thanks,
Mr.
Adam.
Vice Chair, I know we're over. Just one more thing to capture here, because this is the section where housing is. It would be useful to know how we're utilizing our housing stock. So percentage of full-time occupancy, part-time occupancy, and not occupied. So, for example, a house that is only used for rental purposes.
Yeah, and also to kind of on that train, the knowledge or the data on how many folks come and land here but don't live here permanently, and also don't rent it out. I think those are two important sides of it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. It's been a great conversation. We are ramping up into finalizing research, and then we quickly heading into plan development as the screen shares. So thank you. Houston, back to you.
Thanks, Ida. You want to stay on or we need to cut you off?
I'll stay on, just, I guess we all wrap it up here shortly.
Could I make a couple of announcements?
Yeah, Kim, go ahead. So we'll go to you first, and then we'll do, for the good of the community. So if anybody has any comments tonight, please, when Kim is done, please just call it up to the microphone and we'll address it.
I have one thing to address.
Okay.
Okay, as you know, we have posted the zoning ordinance in terms of a link where we encourage everybody to go on there and add in comments to that particular document. We will do the same thing for the subdivision regulations, and we might add a little bit on to piggyback on what SC Group has already been doing. So the idea is that when those three things are done, with all the comments consolidated on one document, then we will use that content to conduct the workshops addressing those particular things. So
Thank you.
the one for the zoning ordinance has been up already. We will cut it off at the end of the month, and hopefully by then we'll have the one for the subdivision up. So people can also visit that document and then also comment, insert your comments in there so that all those comments are also consolidated in one document. And then we'll do that also for all the other documents, and in short order have workshops for all those things to make sure you would have a strategy for how you want to address those things moving forward.
And how are we letting people know that that's there?
For now, we're sending out that link to
This is
the
our-
different civic organizations, planning commission, city commission, sorry, the BZA, and to CPAC members. What I would encourage those members to do is to solicit input outside of your bodies, for something that might want to be added to that.
Yeah, so the process here, if we're looking at this, is that, we've got to start somewhere with how we provide feedback and how it works. So we, as appointed members here and those of the elected members, are providing feedback on zoning, talking about what we want to look at, how we want to do it. This will allow Kim and his group to basically organize their thoughts around what needs to be addressed, what doesn't need to be addressed, that sort of thing. And then so the workshops that come after that,
Exactly.
the workshops are our community input time. This is not
There you go.
an exercise in giving everybody digital access to everything we do. It's a process and following the way that we do things and then moving it into workshops so that we can get feedback from the community.
Exactly.
Tell me, what is the document, and maybe just start right at the very beginning.
Gaila has a link to the document, she can email it to you.
That
Let
the
me share
public
that.
goes on and,
No, it's been sent to CPAC members,
Okay.
BZA members, Plan Commission members,
okay, I
and
didn't
city
misunderstand
commissioners.
completely
No
what you
problem.
said, I'm sorry.
Now, what he said, after that is done, at a workshop,
Okay, but both, yeah.
then community-wide participation, decision-making, comments,
My
inputs
apologies.
will
I
happen.
understand, okay,
No
thank you.
problem.
Thanks, Kim. Does that cover what you wanted to talk about? Christina, you asked that you had something to address.
Well, we've been talking for, I think, 4 months now about bringing in more people, so I thought maybe we could move that along a little bit.
Mayor, does that come from planning commission or come from city commission?
I think the city staff is going to send out a call for expressions of interest for additional CPAC members.
And what is the timeline for that? Is it a 2-cycle thing where you submit that you want to be a part of the commission or part of the committee and then you have to get approved from the city commission publicly, or is it kind of like an appointment that you can do without any other?
I think we'll do it like we did with the CPAC members, so we'll bring it back to the city commission, let the city commission know who's expressed interest, and then we'll identify the members.
Do you have to do 2 reads of that, or is it a singular? Okay, great. So as early as 2 cycles from now, we could have something since we're.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you. All right, so good to the community. Folks, anybody out here have any thoughts today?
I'm at loss at what you're talking about.
The city has a zoning ordinance document that we've been using.
Any particular one? Or are you talking about as a group, the zoning book?
Yes, the zoning book.
Oh,
The zoning
okay.
ordinance, Yes.
As part of, our process of updating the data in here, some of the things that we're looking at on the zoning, they're out of date. And so it's a bit of a scrubbing of the document. We've used that word a lot. And it's also a bit of an addition, a subtraction, what still works for us, what doesn't work for us. And as we go through this community planning, we'll be, discussing whether or not those things should be added or removed. Now, that is not up to us to do any of that. That ends up being to the, city commission to make those final decisions as elected officials. Thank you for that question.
I was just curious when the document became available,
Which document?
the link to the zoning ordinance.
Oh,
So
a couple of days before the past workshop. I can remember the date.
Last week?
About a week ago.
Yes, about a week ago.
And it's going to be up and available only through the end of February, so that's a very short time, or is that a long time?
No, hold on. It is only going to be up for them, the civic officials, to comment on. It will be revisited or it will be introduced and revisited as a document at workshops. So it is not that, it is the officials that comments will receive at the end of the month. So we can then use that to derive a script, a facilitating script for the workshop.
Yeah, Ms. Frederick, basically, we're doing our homework on it, and we'll announce workshops so that we can all participate in it. I don't think the mention of a document to comment on necessarily is meant for public consumption at this point. It's meant for, us as we discuss this first steps of the homework.
Okay. And curious, I know the chamber over the years, I think 2000, early 2000s, Blount County was in non-attainment, But have they not achieved attainment now?
I'm not sure. That's not
We worked
my,
on that for a long time when I was involved, and I thought that Blount County had achieved attainment status, so I was just curious if you all knew that or not.
As far as I know from the last TPO meeting I attended, it's still no attainment. Attainment has not been achieved yet. And I know there's one measuring station up there.
it's at a
Parkway.
Road, yeah.
And a couple of the things that inform it are the traffic in Knoxville, as was mentioned earlier, and also the wildfires that happened as well. So,
Okay.
Anything else we get? Anybody else out there? I'm just gonna stare each of you down.
I want to make a inquiry. Y'all talking about, I know you've talked in the past about green space and trying to conserve green space. And when we had the TCAB organization back, I think it really started about 2003 or 4, sometime in there. We were real concerned with the four-lining of this highway because it was, there's a 300-foot right-of-way here. And I'm going to brag just a little bit. Back in 1948, when I was just a little boy, I used to run around with my daddy who campaigning for the county commission. He got on the county commission, and at that time, DOT was planning to build this highway instead of the old highway that used to wind around. And Senator Estes Kefauver and a fellow by the name of, I can't remember his name now, Robert someone, who was chairman of the Democrat Party in Blount County. They got together, and Senator Kefauver said, if the county will buy a 300-foot right-of-way, he said, I'll see to it that we get a federal appropriation to reimbursement. And he did. People who lived along the old road didn't vote for my daddy next time. They wanted to have their businesses and their houses right next to the road, from one end of town to the other. And, but the 300-foot right-of-way has created a tremendous amount of green space in this cove. And you're talking about view shed, being able to see out and so forth. And one interesting thing about green space, and it's recently come to my attention, conservation reserve, conservation easements were a big issue when we talked about this in the TCAB forum 25, 30 years ago. And a lot of people were really opposed to it because they said, well, conservation easements are going to remove land from potential development in the future, and we need more development. Well, my thoughts right now are that if you all are sincere about the green space protection, you really need to look into conservation easements, and I would very much encourage you to get the advice of Bill Claybaugh, who is now the executive director of Foothills Land Conservancy, and let him explain primarily the economic advantages of it, because it really creates an opportunity for people who own more than one piece of property. When you have a piece of property that's appraised at $200,000 an acre on this highway, and you sell it, especially if it's been in the family a long time, you're going to realize a whole bunch of capital gains. if you want to set aside part of that property into green space, you can cheat the IRS. There are some real economic advantages that I think you all need to think about in terms of this plan that you're putting together. I don't know how the city can get involved in that, but it is an opportunity. I'll just I'm going to point out one more thing. There was a fellow in this town who recently made a whole bunch of money on capital gains. He owned 80-some acres of mountain land here, put it in the conservation reserve, gave it to the Foothills Land Conservancy, wrote a big pile of money, capital gains, off of his tax bill for the coming year. He won, the Tuckledge Cove won, because Foothills Land Conservancy turned around and they won because they sold it to someone to build one house on about 89 acres, I think it was. These are opportunities, economic incentives that you all need to look at instead of putting your thumb down and saying you can't develop something because we want it for green space. That ain't going to work, folks. You need to look at incentives. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to look each of you down. All right, I get a motion to adjourn. Second. All in favor? Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.